Clara Ashford had done something unforgivable. She had been right. The autumn gala at the Whitmore Trade Pavilion was supposed to be an evening of polished conversation and careful alliances. 300 of England's wealthiest merchant families gathered under crystal chandeliers, their laughter echoing across marble floors while servants carried trays of champagne between silk-draped tables. Clara's father, Lord Edwin Ashford, had spent the last of his dwindling savings to secure their invitation. One evening, one chance to find a new investor for the family's collapsing textile operation. And Clara had destroyed it in under 4 minutes. She hadn't meant to speak. She never meant to speak at these things. Her father had told her 100 times, smile, nod, hold your glass with both hands so nobody tries to pull you into a dance, and above all, keep your opinions folded inside your mouth like a letter nobody asked to read. But Lord Pemberton had been standing 3 feet away, loudly explaining his brilliant new railway freight model to a circle of admiring investors. He waved his hands while he spoke, describing how his system of rotating cargo schedules would cut shipping costs across the northern counties by 40%. The numbers floated through the air, and Clara caught every single one of them. They were wrong. His rotation model double-counted the coal surcharge on return freight. His 40% savings was actually a 12% loss disguised by a calendar trick that moved expenses into the following quarter. Any merchant who invested in the scheme would bleed money for 6 months before realizing the mathematics had been built on sand. Clara had turned to her father to whisper this, but Lord Pemberton had chosen that exact moment to pause for applause. The room went quiet, and Clara's whisper landed in the silence like a stone through a window. His return freight calculation is wrong. The coal surcharge applies twice under that rotation. It is a 12% loss, not a 40% gain. Every head turned. Lord Pemberton's face went from pink to dark red. He demanded she repeat herself, so she did, louder this time, because the room was listening, and Clara had never learned how to say something she believed while pretending she didn't believe it. She laid the arithmetic out piece by piece. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't mock him, she simply stated the numbers as they were, and the numbers were devastating. Lord Pemberton was humiliated in front of 300 guests. His investors pulled back before the night was over, and by morning, the Ashford family was finished. Every trading house in London closed its doors. Letters of credit were revoked. Invitations vanished. Clara's younger brother was quietly removed from his apprenticeship at a counting house in the city. Her father sat in his study for 2 days without eating, staring at a stack of rejection letters that grew taller every hour. The message from society was unanimous and absolute. The Ashford name had become a curse, and the girl with the sharp tongue had written it. That was 6 days ago. Now Clara stood alone in the Grand Library of the Capital Council, pulling her personal notebooks from the public reference shelves where she had been storing them for years. Nobody else used this section. The shelves held old trade registries and outdated Port Authority records, documents most people considered worthless. Clara had been studying them since she was 15. Patterns lived inside those columns of ink and numbers. She could read the economic health of an entire county the way other women read novels, chapter by chapter, feeling the story shift beneath the surface. She placed another leather-bound notebook into her canvas bag. The library was nearly empty. Late afternoon light fell through the tall arched windows and made long golden rectangles on the floor. She heard footsteps behind her. Clara turned and found a man standing at the end of the aisle. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, dressed in a dark wool coat that looked expensive, but carried no embroidery, no family crest, no decorative pins. His boots were clean, but built for travel. His dark hair was cut short, practical, and his face carried the kind of stillness that made people step aside on crowded streets. He looked like a man who had walked through 100 rooms and never once asked permission to enter any of them. "Miss Clara Ashford," he said. His voice was low and direct, as though he had already decided the next 10 minutes of this conversation before he arrived.
You have the advantage, sir. I do not know your name.
Raymond Hale, Duke of the Iron Valley and Blackstone Ridge. Clara's hand tightened around her bag. She had never met him, but she knew the name.
Everyone knew the name. The Duke of Iron Valley controlled the most productive merchant territory in the north of England. His coastal estate managed more shipping tonnage than any single port in the country. He was famously reclusive, famously wealthy, and famously difficult to deal with. Merchant houses that tried to cheat his ledgers had a habit of losing their trading licenses within the month. Nobody called him cruel, exactly. They called him precise, and they feared precision far more than cruelty. "I attended the Whitmore Gala," he said. Clara felt her stomach tighten. "Then you saw what happened?" "I saw a woman correct a man's arithmetic in public. I also verified your correction afterwards. You were right. Pemberton's model would have collapsed within 2 quarters. He paused, watching her face the way someone might study a column of figures, looking for the important line. "I am not here to offer sympathy, Miss Ashford. I have a merchant duchy that stretches across 4 counties, 38 active trade routes, over 200 commercial accounts, and a set of financial ledgers that I suspect have been mismanaged for the better part of 3 years. I need someone who can read numbers the way you do." Clara stared at him. "You are offering me a position?" "I am offering you a marriage contract." The words landed between them with the weight of an anvil dropped onto a library floor. "I have no interest in society's rituals," Raymond continued, his expression unchanged. "I have no interest in courtship, in lengthy negotiations with your father, or in any of the theater that surrounds these arrangements. What I need is a partner who can manage the financial machinery of a northern duchy. You need protection from a city that has decided to destroy your family. This is a practical arrangement. I gain your mind, you gain my name and the security it carries." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document sealed with dark wax. He set it on the shelf between them. "The contract is generous. Your family's debts will be settled within the week. Your brother's apprenticeship will be restored under a different house. You will have full authority over the commercial records of Blackstone Ridge. I am not asking you to be a decoration, Miss Ashford. I am asking you to be useful." Clara looked at the document. The wax seal bore the Iron Valley crest, a hammer crossed with a ship's anchor. She thought about her father sitting in his empty study. She thought about her brother's face when he came home carrying his things in a box. She thought about the 300 people at that gala who had watched her tell the truth and then punished her for it. She broke the seal, read the contract in full, and signed her name at the bottom. Raymond folded the document back into his coat without ceremony. "We leave for the north in 2 days," he said. "Pack lightly. The mountain roads are not kind to heavy luggage." Then he turned and walked out of the library, his footsteps steady and unhurried, as though he had just completed a transaction no different from purchasing a shipment of iron ore. Clara stood alone between the shelves, holding an empty pen, and realized that she had just signed away her entire future to a man she had known for less than 5 minutes. And strangely, it was the first decision she had made all week that felt like it might actually save her. The train departed from King's Cross on a grey Tuesday morning, pulling north through a landscape that changed with every hour. London's chimneys and soot-darkened rooftops gave way to open farmland, then rolling hills dotted with sheep, then the first rough edges of moorland where the grass grew thin and the wind bent everything sideways. Clara sat by the window in a private compartment that Raymond had arranged without discussion. The seats were upholstered in green leather, worn soft from use. A small folding table separated them, and Raymond had covered his half of it with papers before the train had even cleared the city limits. He worked in silence. His pen moved across columns of figures with a speed that surprised Clara. She had expected a man of his reputation to delegate everything, to sit back and let clerks handle the details while he concerned himself with broader matters. Instead, he was deep inside the numbers himself, cross-referencing shipping logs against Port Authority receipts, his brow furrowed in concentration. Clara watched the countryside pass for the first hour. She had never been north of Birmingham. The world outside her window was becoming wilder, less tamed, the fields giving way to stretches of bracken and dark stone walls that climbed the hillsides like stitching on old cloth. Occasionally, a village appeared, a cluster of slate roofs and a church spire, and then it was gone again, swallowed by the emptiness. She tried to read. She had brought 2 of her notebooks and a slim volume on mercantile law that she had borrowed from the library before closing her account. But the words sat flat on the page. Her mind kept circling back to the same unanswerable questions. What kind of household was she walking into? What would the staff think of a disgraced merchant's daughter arriving as their new duchess? And who exactly was this man sitting across from her, who had offered her his name with less ceremony than most men used to order supper? Raymond had spoken perhaps 9 words since boarding the train. Tea at the platform. The schedule has changed when they were informed of a delay outside Sheffield. And move your bag when he needed to reach his document case. Clara was not offended by the silence. She had grown up in a house full of talk. Her mother's endless social commentary, her father's nervous negotiations with creditors, and most of it had accomplished nothing. Raymond's quiet felt different. It had weight to it, like the silence of a man who had already decided that words were a limited resource and refused to waste them. They changed at York to a smaller branch line that climbed into the northern hills. The compartment on this train was narrower, the seats harder, and the view outside grew steadily more dramatic. Deep valleys opened beneath the track. Rivers cut white paths through dark rock. The air coming through the gaps in the window frame was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of peat and damp stone. At a small junction station perched on a high ridge, the train stopped to take on water and additional cargo. Raymond stepped onto the platform to speak with a porter about the onward connection, and Clara found herself alone with his papers. She did not intend to look at them. She looked at them. The top sheet was a cargo manifest for a shipment of wool moving from Blackstone Ridge to a warehouse in Liverpool. Beneath it was a routing schedule showing how the duchy's goods moved between 6 northern ports across the winter months. Clara's eyes moved down the columns automatically, the way a musician's fingers find keys without thinking. Something caught her attention on the 3rd page. She pulled it closer, tilting it toward the window for better light. Raymond's winter routing schedule sent his merchant vessels down the coast in a fixed loop. Blackstone Ridge to Whitby, Whitby to Scarborough, Scarborough to Hull, Hull to Grimsby, and back again. Each leg of the journey carried a different cargo, and each port charged a different docking tariff based on the weight of goods aboard. The schedule was clean, methodical, and entirely logical. It was also bleeding money. The problem was subtle enough that most people would never see it. The docking tariffs at Hull and Grimsby were calculated on gross cargo weight, which included the weight of the packing crates themselves. But the tariffs at Whitby and Scarborough were calculated on net cargo weight, excluding packaging. Raymond's schedule treated all 4 ports identically, applying the same weight figures across the board. This meant that every shipment passing through Hull and Grimsby was being overtaxed by roughly 8% because the crate weight was being counted twice, once in the cargo total and once in the tariff calculation. Over a single voyage, the loss was small. Over an entire winter shipping season, across dozens of vessels, it would amount to hundreds of pounds simply evaporating into Port Authority fees that should never have been charged. Clara pulled her own notebook from her bag and began scribbling corrections, reworking the weight calculations, port by port. She was so absorbed that she did not hear Raymond return to the compartment until his shadow fell across the page. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, watching her write in the margins of his shipping schedule. "Those are my private trade documents," he said. "Your docking tariff calculations at Hull and Grimsby are wrong. Clara replied. You are applying gross weight figures to ports that charge on net weight, and net weight figures to ports that charge on gross. Every voyage through those two ports costs you roughly 8% more than it should. Raymond said nothing for several seconds. He stepped into the compartment, sat down across from her, and held out his hand. Clara passed the manifest back, along with her notebook, where she had rewritten the corrected figures. He studied her calculations in silence. His eyes moved between her notebook and his own documents 3 times. Then he set both down on the table and looked at her directly. It was the first time since the library that he had given her his full attention, and Clara felt the force of it. His gaze was steady, measuring, entirely without pretense. "How long did it take you to find that?" he asked.
A few minutes. The pattern is quite clear once you separate the tariff structures by port. My senior shipping clerk has managed these routes for 11 years. He has never identified that error. Perhaps he was not looking for it. Raymond leaned back against the seat. Something shifted in his expression, a loosening around the jaw, a faint change in the set of his mouth that might have been the ghost of respect. I chose well, he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he gathered his papers into a single stack and placed them on Clara's side of the table. Read all of them, he said. We arrive at Blackstone Ridge tomorrow evening. I want your assessment of every route in that file before we reach the front door. He folded his arms, closed his eyes, and appeared to fall asleep within minutes, leaving Clara alone with a mountain of trade documents and the first indication that this strange, silent man might actually be worth working for. She opened the next file and began to read. Outside the window, the moors stretched dark and endless under a heavy sky, and the train carried them deeper into the north, toward a life that neither of them had planned, but both of them had chosen. The carriage climbed the final ridge just as the last light of the afternoon was draining from the sky. Clara had spent the better part of the day being rattled along narrow mountain roads in a coach that smelled of old leather and iron fittings, her body aching from 2 days of travel, her mind still turning over the shipping documents Raymond had handed her on the train. Then the road curved around a wall of dark granite, and Blackstone Ridge appeared below them. Clara leaned forward in her seat. The estate was enormous. A sprawling manor of gray stone sat on a broad cliff overlooking a natural harbor where the sea came crashing against a curved breakwater. The house itself was 4 stories tall, built in hard, straight lines with narrow windows and thick walls designed to hold against coastal storms. There was no decorative garden, no ornamental fountain, no attempt at softness anywhere. The building looked like it had grown out of the rock beneath it, stubborn and immovable, the same way barnacles attach themselves to the hull of a ship. Below the manor, the harbor town spread along the waterfront in a dense tangle of warehouses, counting houses, and docking platforms. Even from this distance, Clara could see the masts of merchant vessels crowded along the piers, their sails furled tight against the evening wind. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. Lanterns were being lit along the harbor wall. The whole place hummed with activity, a working town built around commerce and salt air. Blackstone Ridge, Raymond said from the opposite seat. It was the first thing he had spoken in over 3 hours. It is larger than I expected, Clara said. It needs to be. 14 merchant houses operate from this harbor. We handle more freight tonnage in a single winter than most southern ports see in a year. The carriage descended the ridge road in a series of sharp turns and pulled through a heavy iron gate into a cobblestone courtyard. Servants appeared immediately, footmen in dark wool livery, a housekeeper in a starched gray dress, stable hands already reaching for the horses. Everyone moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had been trained to anticipate rather than react. Raymond stepped out first and offered Clara his hand. She took it briefly, stepping down onto the cobblestones, and found herself standing in front of the largest private residence she had ever seen. Up close, the manor was even more imposing. The stone walls were blackened in places by decades of sea wind and coal smoke, giving the building a weathered, battle-tested appearance.
The front entrance was a set of heavy oak doors, iron-studded, wide enough to drive a small cart through. "Mrs. Hargrove," Raymond said, addressing the housekeeper, "this is Miss Clara Ashford. She is now the Duchess of Blackstone Ridge. Prepare the Eastern Suite and ensure she has access to every room in this house without exception." Mrs. Hargrove was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her entire face. She studied Clara for a long moment, her expression impossible to read, then gave a precise curtsy. "Welcome, Your Grace. I will have your rooms prepared within the hour." Clara noticed the slight pause before the curtsy, the careful way Mrs. Hargrove's eyes moved across her traveling clothes, her scuffed boots, the canvas bag she was still carrying over one shoulder like a university student. The housekeeper was measuring her, filing away every detail for later judgment. Clara kept her posture straight and said nothing. She had spent her whole life being measured by people who had already decided she was lacking. One more would make no difference. Raymond led her through the main entrance into a cavernous hall lined with dark wood paneling and iron candelabras. Portraits of previous dukes hung along the walls in heavy gilt frames. Hard-faced men in naval coats, merchant lords with ledger books open on their desks. One ancestor painted standing on the prow of a trading vessel with the Blackstone harbor visible behind him. There was not a single portrait of a duchess anywhere. They passed through a series of corridors that smelled of beeswax and coal smoke until they reached a room at the heart of the building. Raymond pushed open a pair of heavy doors and stepped aside. The central archive was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, packed with leather-bound ledgers, rolled charts, sealed correspondence bundles, and wooden filing cabinets with brass handles. A long oak table ran down the center of the room, scarred with ink stains and compass marks. Maps of coastal trade routes hung on the far wall, pinned with colored tacks marking active shipping lanes. The room smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and Clara felt something loosen inside her chest, a tension she had been carrying since the night of the gala. This was a room built for thinking, and someone was handing her the keys to it. Raymond reached into his coat and produced a ring of iron keys, 6 in total, each one labeled with a small paper tag. He held them out to Clara. "These open every cabinet, every vault, and every locked drawer in this archive. The household accounts, the shipping records, the Port Authority correspondence, the guild contracts. All of it falls under your authority as of this evening." Clara took the keys. They were heavy in her hand, cold from the outside air. "You should know," Raymond continued, "that I am not giving you these because I trust you. I am giving you these because the numbers in this room have been telling me a story I cannot read, and every clerk I have employed in the last 5 years has either been too slow to follow it or too frightened to tell me what it means. You are here because you are neither." He turned toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "Supper is at 8. Mrs. Hargrove will show you to your rooms. Tomorrow morning, I will introduce you to the trade syndicate representatives. They will try to intimidate you. I suggest you let them try." Then he was gone, his boots echoing down the stone corridor, leaving Clara alone in a room full of records that nobody had been brave enough to read honestly. She set down her bag, pulled the nearest ledger from the shelf, and opened it on the long table. The entries were dated 3 years back, quarterly revenue reports from the harbor's 14 merchant houses. Clara ran her finger down the first column, and within 30 seconds she could already see it. The numbers were clean on the surface, well organized, properly totaled. But beneath the tidy columns, something was moving. Small inconsistencies, tiny rounding errors that always went in the same direction, shaving fractions off the top of every transaction, like a blade removing thin curls of wood. Someone had been very careful, and someone had been very patient. Clara pulled a second ledger from the shelf, then a third. She lined them up side by side on the table, opened her own notebook and began to cross-reference. Outside, the wind picked up off the sea, rattling the archive windows in their iron frames. The lamps flickered once and steadied. Clara did not look up. She was reading the story Raymond could not find, and the first chapter was already making her uneasy.
Whatever was wrong in this duchy, it had been wrong for a long time. The dining hall at Blackstone Ridge was built to remind visitors exactly where power sat. A single long table of polished oak stretched nearly the full length of the room, set beneath a vaulted ceiling of exposed stone arches. Iron chandeliers hung on thick chains, each one holding 30 candles that threw a warm, unsteady light across the silverware. The walls were lined with framed trade charters dating back 100 years, each one bearing the ducal seal of the Hale family, a reminder that every merchant who operated from this harbor did so because a duke had once signed a piece of paper allowing it. Clara had spent the 3 days since her arrival buried in the central archive, pulling ledgers, cross-referencing port receipts, and building a mental map of the duchy's finances. She had barely spoken to Raymond during that time.
He appeared at meals, exchanged a few words about her progress, and disappeared again into his own wing of the manor. Their arrangement remained exactly what he had described, a working partnership, efficient and emotionally bare. Tonight was different. Tonight, Raymond had invited the leaders of the harbor's merchant guild to a formal dinner, and Clara understood exactly what this was. A test. The guild masters had operated under Raymond's authority for years, accustomed to dealing with a duke who enforced his will through reputation and economic pressure. A new duchess was an unknown quantity, and unknown quantities made merchants nervous. Nervous merchants either folded or attacked, and Clara had a strong suspicion these men were not the folding kind. She dressed carefully for the evening. Mrs. Hargrove had arranged for a gown to be delivered from a dressmaker in the town, deep blue silk with a high collar, modest and well-fitted, appropriate for a woman of rank without being ostentatious. Clara pinned her hair up simply and wore no jewelry except the thin gold band from the marriage contract. She wanted to look like exactly what she was, someone who had come to work. The guildmasters arrived at 7. There were 5 of them, all men past 50, all wearing the heavy wool coats and polished watch chains of successful northern merchants. Clara had already memorized their names and trading portfolios from the archive records. Mr. Alderton controlled the wool export trade. Mr. Greaves handled coal and mineral shipments. Mr. Fenton ran the timber operations. Mr. Locke managed the grain stores. And Mr. Drummond, the eldest and most influential of the group, oversaw the harbor's general freight operations and served as the guild's informal spokesman.
Raymond greeted them at the entrance to the dining hall with his usual economy. Handshakes, brief nods, no small talk. He introduced Clara simply as the Duchess and gestured for everyone to sit. The first course was served, a clear broth with winter vegetables, and the conversation began with the careful politeness of men testing the temperature of a room. Drummond asked about the journey from London. Alderton commented on the weather. Fenton mentioned a shipment of Baltic pine that had arrived ahead of schedule. Clara ate quietly and listened. She could feel the guild masters assessing her from across the table, measuring her silence, trying to decide whether it came from shyness or strategy. The real business began with the second course. Drummond set down his spoon, dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin, and turned to Raymond with the practiced ease of a man who had been negotiating across dinner tables for 30 years. Your Grace, we should discuss the seasonal tribute before the winter shipping lanes close. The Guild has prepared an updated assessment of the quarter's trading revenue, and I am afraid the figures are less favorable than last year. He produced a folded document from his breast pocket and slid it across the table toward Raymond. Raymond glanced at it, then pushed it sideways toward Clara without a word. Drummond's eyebrows lifted slightly. He had expected the Duke to review the numbers himself. Clara unfolded the document and began reading. The guild's report was 4 pages long, dense with figures, and written in the specialized shorthand that northern merchant houses used to record cargo volumes, port fees, and profit margins. Most people outside the trade would find it incomprehensible. Clara read it the way she read everything, quickly, completely, and with her memory holding every number in place like pins on a map.
The report claimed that the guild's collective revenue had dropped by nearly 20% compared to the previous winter. Drummond's summary attributed this to increased tariffs at foreign ports, a poor harvest reducing grain export volumes, and unexpected repair costs to several merchant vessels. The conclusion was straightforward. The guild owed less tribute to the duchy because the guild had earned less money. Clara finished reading and set the document on the table. "Mr. Drummond," she said, "your report lists a 20% revenue decline driven by 3 factors. May I ask a few questions about each?" Drummond smiled. "Of course, Your Grace." "Your foreign port tariff increase. You cite a 15% rise at the Rotterdam docks as your primary cost pressure. I reviewed the Duchy's incoming correspondence from the Dutch Trade Office last Tuesday. The Rotterdam tariff increase was 8%, applied only to grain shipments exceeding 40 tons per vessel. Your fleet averages 26 tons per vessel on that route. The increase would have affected 2 of your 14 Rotterdam-bound ships this quarter. That is not a 15% cost pressure. That is a rounding error." The smile faded from Drummond's face. Clara continued without pause. "Your harvest shortfall. You report a 30% reduction in exportable grain from the surrounding farms. The Duchy's own purchasing records show that Mr. Locke's grain operation bought the same volume of wheat this autumn as last year, within 4%. If the harvest had truly failed by 30%, his buying figures would reflect it. They do not." Locke shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Greaves stared at his plate. "And your vessel repair costs. You list emergency hull repairs on 3 ships totaling £600. The harbour dockmaster's maintenance log, which I also reviewed, records 1 hull repair this quarter on Mr. Fenton's timber barge for a cost of £92. I could not find any record of the other 2 repairs in the dockmaster's files, the shipwright's invoices, or the harbour authority's incident reports." Silence filled the dining hall. The candles flickered in the chandeliers. Drummond's jaw was set tight, his composure cracking along lines that years of bluffing had kept hidden. Clara folded the guild's report neatly in half and placed it back on the table. "Your actual revenue this quarter is within 6% of last year's figure. The tribute owed to the Duchy should be calculated accordingly. I will have the corrected assessment delivered to your offices by Friday morning." Raymond had not spoken a single word during the entire exchange. He sat at the head of the table with his hands folded, watching his guild masters the way a man watches a finished game of chess, studying the final position of every piece. Drummond looked at Raymond, searching for some sign that the Duke might intervene, might soften the blow, might offer the kind of quiet compromise that had greased these negotiations for years. Raymond picked up his wine glass and took a slow sip. "I believe the Duchess has made the Duchy's position clear," he said. "Shall we have the 3rd course?" The rest of the dinner passed in near silence. The guild masters ate quickly, spoke little, and left before dessert was served. Drummond was the last to go, pausing at the doorway to look back at Clara with an expression she recognized from 100 similar faces in London. It was the look of a man who had just realized that the person sitting across from him was playing an entirely different game, and winning. After the doors closed, Raymond set down his glass and regarded Clara across the empty table. 6% variance, he said. "You are certain?" 5.8 if we account for the Rotterdam adjustment. He nodded slowly. "They have been inflating those shortage claims for at least 4 years. Every quarter, a little more shaved off the top. I knew the numbers were wrong, but I could never find where the lies were sewn into the fabric." "They were clever about it," Clara admitted. "Each individual claim was plausible on its own. The trick was making sure nobody ever laid them all side by side and checked them against the Duchy's own records." "Nobody did," Raymond said. "Until you." He stood from the table, straightened his coat, and walked toward the door. As he passed Clara's chair, he paused for half a step.
Well done, Duchess. Then he was gone, and Clara sat alone in the enormous dining hall, surrounded by empty chairs and the lingering smell of candle wax, feeling for the first time since leaving London that she might actually belong somewhere. The subterranean vaults beneath Blackstone Ridge had been carved into the cliff face 2 generations ago by Raymond's grandfather, a man who understood that a coastal duchy survived winters on what it stored, not what it earned. The tunnels ran deep into the rock, branching into a network of grain silos, coal bunkers, and dry storage chambers that could hold enough provisions to feed the harbour town and its surrounding villages for 4 months without a single ship entering port. Clara had requested the inspection herself. After dismantling the Guildmaster's tribute report, she had spent 2 more days in the Central Archive, working backwards through 3 years of quarterly supply records. The paper trail was immaculate. Every grain delivery was logged, every coal shipment weighed and recorded, every inventory count signed off by Raymond's head quartermaster, a man named George Hale, Raymond's cousin on his mother's side, who had managed the duchy's physical stores for nearly a decade. On paper, the duchy was prepared for the hardest winter the North Sea could throw at it. The silos were full, the coal reserves were healthy, the outer towns had received their seasonal allocations on schedule. Clara wanted to see the silos with her own eyes. Raymond agreed without hesitation. He arrived at the vault entrance on the morning of the 12th day, wearing a heavy coat and carrying a lantern, looking as though a physical audit of underground storage chambers was a perfectly normal way to spend a Tuesday. 2 estate workers accompanied them, carrying additional lamps and the master inventory ledger that George had submitted at the end of the previous month. The first vault was coal. They descended a flight of stone steps into a wide chamber with a vaulted ceiling, the walls black with decades of dust. The bunker was roughly 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with measuring posts driven into the walls at regular intervals to indicate volume. George's report claimed the bunker held 420 tons of Welsh anthracite, enough to supply the manor, the harbor, and the 6 nearest villages through March. Clara walked the length of the bunker, counting the measuring posts and estimating the depth of coal against each one. She did not need to finish the calculation. The shortage was visible. "This is not 420 tons," she said, turning to Raymond. "The coal reaches the 3rd measuring post at most. That puts the actual volume closer to 280. Raymond held his lantern higher, casting light across the uneven surface of the coal pile. His expression did not change, that Clara saw his free hand close into a fist at his side. "Show me the grain stores," he said. They moved deeper into the tunnels. The grain silos were separate chambers, each one sealed with heavy wooden doors to keep out moisture and vermin. George's inventory listed 8 silos at full capacity: wheat, barley, oats, and rye, enough to supply bread and animal feed for the entire region. Clara opened the first silo door and held her lantern inside. The silo was built as a tall, cylindrical chamber, roughly 15 feet across, with the grain piled high against the back wall. It looked full at first glance. Then Clara stepped inside and walked around the pile. The grain had been stacked against one wall only. Behind the mound, the rest of the silo was empty. Someone had arranged the stores to create the illusion of a full chamber when viewed from the doorway. A quick inspection would show a healthy supply. A thorough one would reveal the truth. She checked 3 more silos. Each one told the same story. Grain pushed to the front, empty space behind it. The actual reserves were perhaps half of what the paperwork claimed. Clara stepped out of the 4th silo and faced Raymond in the narrow corridor. The lamplight carved deep shadows across his face. "Your winter stores have been systematically reduced," she said. "The coal is short by roughly 1/3. The grain is short by nearly half. Someone has been moving supplies out of these vaults and replacing the physical evidence with careful staging." "The outer towns," Raymond said. His voice was tight, controlled, the anger held behind his teeth like something he refused to release. "The villages beyond the harbor requires on these reserves. If a hard frost comes and the shipping lanes freeze, they will have nothing.
That is the design, Clara said. Whoever is doing this wants the outer towns to run short. When the shortage becomes public, the local markets will panic. Grain and coal prices will triple overnight. Anyone holding a private stockpile of those supplies could sell them back to the duchy at enormous profit, and your name would carry the blame for failing to protect your own people. Raymond stood very still for a long moment. The only sound was the distant drip of water somewhere deeper in the tunnels, and the faint whistle of wind through the ventilation shafts. "George signed these inventory reports," he said. "Every single one. George has managed these vaults since my father's time. He is family." Clara said nothing. She understood what she was implying, and she understood the weight of it. Accusing a man's blood relative of betrayal was a different matter entirely from embarrassing merchant guild leaders over dinner. This was the kind of discovery that could fracture a household. "I am not drawing conclusions yet," Clara said carefully. "I am telling you what the numbers show. The reports do not match the physical stores. The discrepancy is too large and too consistent to be accidental. Someone with access to these vaults and authority over the inventory records has been moving supplies out over a period of months, possibly years. And the only person with that access is George. He is the most obvious candidate, but I want to trace where the supplies went before I say anything further. If the grain and coal were sold, there will be a buyer. If they were moved, there will be a transport record somewhere, a barge manifest, a wagon hire, something. Goods do not disappear. They go somewhere, and the trail always leaves marks." Raymond looked at her for a long time, his lantern throwing a steady circle of gold across the damp stone floor. She could see him working through the implications, the same way she worked through a column of figures, methodically, thoroughly, following every line to its end before making a decision. "What do you need?" he asked. "Access to the harbor's private cargo manifests, the ones filed by individual merchants, not the guild summaries, and the wagon hire records from the town's 3 coaching companies. If someone moved this volume of goods out of your vaults, they needed transport, and transport leaves paperwork. You will have everything by tomorrow morning." He turned and began walking back toward the vault entrance, his boots echoing off the stone walls. Clara followed, carrying her lantern in one hand and the master inventory ledger in the other, the false numbers glowing on the page like a confession waiting to be read aloud. Halfway up the steps, Raymond stopped and turned back to her. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. "If it is George," he said, "I will deal with it. Whoever is responsible, regardless of their name or their blood, I will deal with it. I need you to understand that." "I understand." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then continued up the stairs without another word. Clara followed him into the grey daylight, carrying the weight of a discovery that was about to test whether this partnership of paper and ink could survive something far more dangerous than arithmetic. The harbour district of Blackstone Ridge transformed itself for the winter trade fair the way a plain woman might transform herself for a ball, completely, joyfully, and with a determination that bordered on defiance. Coloured banners stretched between the warehouse rooftops, snapping in the sea wind. Market stalls lined every cobblestone street, from the docking platforms to the town square, their wooden counters piled with wool bolts, leather goods, smoked fish, bottled preserves, ironwork, and 100 other products drawn from every corner of the northern counties. Merchants who spent the rest of the year communicating through letters and invoices now stood shoulder to shoulder, shouting prices across the crowd, shaking hands on deals that would shape their fortunes for the coming season. The smell of roasting chestnuts mixed with salt air and the sharp tang of fresh-cut timber. Clara had never seen anything like it. London had its markets, certainly, but they operated with a self-conscious dignity that kept the chaos at arm's length. Here, the chaos was the point. The fair was loud, dense, and alive with the particular energy of people who worked hard for their money and intended to spend it with equal commitment. She and Raymond entered the harbour district on foot, moving through the crowd together. Raymond had dressed plainly, dark coat, no crest, no visible markers of rank, but people recognized him anyway. Stallholders straightened up as he passed. Merchants interrupted their conversations to offer quick nods. The Duke of Blackstone Ridge was known here the way a lighthouse is known to sailors. You did not need to see the name to recognize the shape. Clara walked beside him, dressed in a wool coat and a dark bonnet that Mrs. Hargrove had selected with her usual silent precision. She carried a small leather notebook inside her coat pocket and a pencil sharpened to a fine point. To anyone watching, she looked like a duchess taking a polite tour of the local festivities. In reality, she was hunting. Over the past 6 days, Clara had torn through the harbour's private cargo manifests and the wagon hire records from all 3 coaching companies in the town.
The trail she found was careful and deliberate. Supplies had been moved out of the duchy's vaults in small batches over a period of 18 months, loaded onto private wagons during overnight hours, and transported to a set of rented warehouse spaces on the eastern edge of the harbour. From there, the goods were loaded onto merchant vessels registered under names Clara did not recognize, small trading companies with no visible connection to the Blackstone Ridge Guild. She had traced 4 of these companies through their harbour registration papers. All 4 shared the same mailing address, a solicitor's office in Whitby, and all 4 had filed their registration documents within 3 months of each other, roughly 2 years ago. Someone had built an entire shadow operation to drain the duchy's reserves and sell them through a network of shell companies. The planning was sophisticated, the execution was patient.
And the winter trade fair, with its massive influx of outside merchants and cargo traffic, was the perfect cover for moving large volumes of goods without attracting attention. Clara had explained all of this to Raymond the previous evening in the Central Archive, laying out her findings across the long oak table like a surgeon displaying instruments before an operation. Raymond had listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, his hands flat on the table. When she finished, he asked a single question. "Can you identify the vessels?" "If they are in the harbour during the fair, yes. The registration numbers will match the manifests I pulled from the Whitby solicitors' filings." "Then we go to the fair." They had developed a system. Clara would move through the market stalls closest to the waterfront, examining the merchant vessels moored along the piers. Each ship carried its registration number painted on the stern. She would note the numbers in her book and compare them against the list she had compiled from the cargo manifests. Raymond would keep a wider view, watching the dockside warehouses for unusual loading activity. Communication was the challenge. The fair was loud enough to swallow any conversation beyond 3 feet, and they could not afford to be seen conferring obviously over harbour records. Clara suggested a set of simple hand signals. Touching her bonnet meant she had found a matching vessel. Adjusting her left glove meant the ship was actively being loaded. And clasping both hands in front of her meant she needed Raymond to come closer for a private word. Raymond had agreed to this system with the faint expression of a man who found the idea both practical and faintly absurd. They separated near the fish market, and Clara made her way toward the eastern piers, where the smaller trading vessels were moored in tight rows. She walked slowly, pausing at stalls to examine goods, playing the part of a curious duchess, while her eyes moved steadily across the painted sterns of every ship in the row. The third pier gave her what she needed, a squat cargo brig with a dark green hull, its stern bearing the registration number that matched the first of her 4 shell companies. The vessel was riding low in the water, heavy with cargo. 2 men were loading additional crates from a handcart on the pier, working quickly and without the usual dockside banter. Clara touched her bonnet and adjusted her left glove. Within 2 minutes, Raymond appeared at her side, positioning himself between Clara and the pier as though they had simply paused to admire the harbour view. "The green brig," Clara said quietly. "Registration matches the first Whitby company. She is being loaded right now." Raymond's eyes moved to the vessel. His jaw tightened. "And there," Clara continued, nodding toward the far end of the pier, "the grey sloop with the patched mainsail. That registration matches the 3rd company on my list. 2 of 4 vessels confirmed." Raymond was quiet for a moment, watching the men load the green brig. Then he did something Clara had not anticipated. He stepped closer to her, placing himself between her and the dockworker's line of sight, angling his body so that she was partially shielded from view.
"We have enough," he said. "I want you away from the waterfront."
I can identify the other 2 vessels if we continue along the eastern quay.
"Clara," his voice dropped lower. "The men loading that brig are not regular dock workers. I recognize one of them. He runs a crew out of Grimsby that handles enforcement work for merchant houses that prefer not to get their own hands dirty. If they realize what you are doing with that notebook, this becomes a different kind of problem." His hand found her elbow, and the grip was firm without being rough. Clara looked up at his face and saw something there she had not seen before. The stoic mask had cracked along a new line, and underneath it was something raw, urgent, entirely personal. He was frightened for her. Genuinely frightened, in a way that had nothing to do with ledgers or trade routes or the political consequences of a supply scandal. "Please," he said. The words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, like a tool he had not picked up in years. Clara closed her notebook and allowed him to guide her back through the crowd, his hand remaining on her arm the entire way. They did not speak again until they reached the carriage waiting at the edge of the market square. As the coach pulled away from the fair, Clara glanced back through the window at the harbour. The green brig was still being loaded. The grey sloop sat motionless at its mooring. Somewhere in that maze of piers and warehouses, the other 2 vessels were waiting, carrying stolen goods under borrowed names. She turned back to find Raymond watching her from the opposite seat, his expression still carrying that unfamiliar openness, as though the afternoon had stripped away a layer he could not put back. "Thank you," Clara said, "for pulling me out." "Do not thank me for common sense," he replied, but his voice had lost its edge, and he looked away toward the window a moment too quickly. Clara opened her notebook on her lap and began writing down everything she had seen while it was still fresh. 2 vessels confirmed, 2 still missing, and a man sitting across from her who had just revealed, without intending to, that this contract marriage had become something he was no longer willing to lose. Clara spent 4 days building the case. She worked in the Central Archive from early morning until the lamps burned low at night, surrounded by cargo manifests, wagon hire receipts, harbour registration documents, and the false inventory reports that George Hale had been signing for 18 months. She cross-referenced every stolen shipment against the 4 shell companies registered through the Whitby solicitor. She matched loading dates to overnight wagon movements. She tracked the revenue from sold goods through a series of private bank drafts that George had carelessly deposited into an account at a Scarborough counting house under a name that was almost his own, G.
Halewood. The man had been thorough in his theft and sloppy in his greed. The operation itself was sophisticated, built in layers designed to survive casual inspection, but George had made the mistake that every careful thief eventually makes. He had started spending the money, and money always leaves footprints. By the morning of the 22nd day, Clara had assembled a complete ledger, 46 pages of documented evidence, cross-referenced 3 ways, showing exactly how much had been taken, when it had been moved, where it had been sold, and how the profits had been concealed. She bound the pages in a leather folio, set it on Raymond's desk in his private study, and waited. Raymond arrived at 9 o'clock, carrying a cup of tea that he set down without drinking. He opened the folio and began reading. Clara stood by the window, watching the harbour below, giving him the silence the document required. He read for nearly 40 minutes without speaking. Occasionally, he turned back a page to re-examine a figure or trace a connection Clara had drawn between 2 entries. When he reached the final page, he closed the folio and placed both hands flat on the desk. "You are certain this is complete," he said. "Every figure in that ledger can be verified against original documents held either in this archive or in the public records at the Scarborough counting house. I have noted the source for each entry in the margins. The bank drafts, the ones deposited under the Halewood name." 6 deposits over 14 months. The amounts correspond precisely to the estimated market value of the goods removed from your vaults during the same periods. The counting house will have its own records of the transactions. Those cannot be altered without their cooperation, and they have no reason to protect George. Raymond stared at the closed folio for a long moment. Clara could see the weight of it pressing down on him, heavier than any number on the page. George Hale was not a distant relative or a minor figure in the household. He had been Raymond's companion since boyhood. They had grown up together on this estate, learned to ride together, attended the same schools. George had stood beside Raymond at his father's funeral. He had been trusted with the duchy's physical reserves precisely because Raymond considered him the one person in the world who would never betray that trust. "Send for him," Raymond said. George Hale arrived at the study 20 minutes later, escorted by Mrs. Hargrove, who had been given no explanation for the summons. He entered the room with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself secure in his position. He was Raymond's age, perhaps a year older, with sandy hair and a broad, open face that carried the permanent sunburn of someone who spent his days moving between outdoor storage yards and harbor warehouses. He dressed well for a quartermaster. Good boots, a tailored waistcoat, a silver watch chain that Clara now recognized as rather too expensive for a man on a quartermaster's salary. "Raymond," George said, nodding to the Duke. He glanced at Clara with the polite disinterest he had shown her since her arrival, the look of a man who considered her presence temporary and her authority decorative. "Sit down, George," Raymond said. George sat in the leather chair facing the desk. Raymond pushed the folio across to him and opened it to the first page. "Clara has conducted a full audit of the duchy's winter reserves and the associated financial records. I would like you to review her findings." George picked up the folio with an expression of mild curiosity, as though he had been handed a mildly interesting newspaper article. He read the first page. His expression held. He turned to the second page. Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker, quickly controlled. By the 5th page, the color had begun to drain from his face, starting at the ears and working inward. He set the folio down and looked at Raymond. "This is absurd," he said. His voice was steady, practiced, the voice of a man who had rehearsed his defense long before he ever expected to need it. "These figures have been manipulated. Your wife has taken legitimate records and rearranged them to create a narrative that does not exist." "Which figures specifically?" Clara asked from the window. George turned to her with an expression that had abandoned all pretense of politeness. "I have managed these stores for nearly 10 years. Every inventory report I have filed has been accurate and verified by my own staff. If there are discrepancies, they exist because someone has tampered with the archive copies after the fact. And the only person who has had unrestricted access to that archive for the past 3 weeks is you." "You are suggesting that I fabricated 46 pages of cross-referenced evidence," Clara said, "including bank drafts held at a Scarborough counting house, harbor registration documents filed with the Port Authority, and wagon hire receipts signed by 3 independent coaching companies, all in 3 weeks, while simultaneously managing the duchy's active commercial accounts. I am suggesting that a woman who arrived here with nothing and owes everything to her position might have reason to manufacture a crisis that makes her appear indispensable." The room went very quiet. George looked at Raymond, searching for the reaction he expected. Doubt, hesitation, the natural reluctance of a man to believe his own family capable of betrayal. He was counting on blood to outweigh paper. He was counting on years of shared history to cloud the arithmetic. Raymond stood up from behind his desk. "George," he said, "I have reviewed every page of that ledger. I have traced Clara's sources myself. The bank drafts exist. The Whitby Shell Companies exist. The cargo manifests exist. And the grain silos that you reported as full 3 weeks ago are half empty. I walked through them personally." George opened his mouth to speak. "I am not finished," Raymond said, and his voice carried a quality Clara had not heard before. It was quiet, controlled, and absolutely final, like the sound of a heavy door being locked from the inside. "You have served this household since we were boys. You sat with me through my father's illness. You carried his coffin. And you have used every ounce of that trust to steal from the people I am sworn to protect." George's composure broke. His face crumpled inward, the mask falling away to reveal something smaller and more desperate underneath. He looked like a man watching the ground open beneath his feet.
"You have until tomorrow morning to remove your personal belongings from the estate," Raymond continued. "Your authority over the duchy's stores is terminated as of this moment. The Scarborough account will be frozen by the end of the week, and every penny you have taken will be recovered. If you contest any of this, Clara's ledger will be presented to the county magistrate, and the matter will become public." George stood slowly from the chair. He looked at Raymond one last time, searching for something, mercy, perhaps, or the remnant of a bond that might still be bent in his favor. He found nothing. Raymond's face was stone, set hard against everything their shared history might have once meant. George walked out of the study without another word. His footsteps faded down the corridor, and then there was silence. Raymond sank back into his chair and pressed both hands against his eyes. He stayed like that for a long time. Clara remained by the window, giving him the space to carry what he had just done. "You were right," he said finally, lowering his hands. "Every line of it. I wish I had not been." He looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, his eyes held something unguarded and deeply tired. "So do I," he said. Clara crossed the room, closed the folio, and placed it in the desk drawer. Then she sat in the chair George had vacated and said nothing, because some moments did not require words, and this man, who had just chosen her judgment over his own blood, deserved the dignity of silence. The journey south felt nothing like the journey north. 3 weeks earlier, Clara had left London as a disgraced merchant's daughter, sitting across from a stranger, watching the countryside pass through a rain-streaked window, while her future balanced on a contract she had signed in desperation. Now she sat in the same position, in a similar compartment, on a train moving in the opposite direction, carrying 46 pages of evidence that would reshape the commercial landscape of northern England. Raymond sat across from her, reviewing the presentation notes Clara had prepared for the Grand Trade Council. He read with the focused intensity she had come to recognize as his natural state. Brow slightly furrowed, pen in hand, making small marks in the margins where he had questions. Occasionally he glanced up at her, and something passed between them that neither acknowledged aloud. A steadiness, a mutual recognition that whatever happened in the capital, they would face it as a single front. The Grand Trade Council met quarterly in the Exchange Hall, a columned limestone building on Threadneedle Street that served as the commercial parliament of England's merchant class. Every significant trading house in the country held a seat. Disputes between provinces were settled here. Trade agreements were ratified, and reputations were made or destroyed, depending on how convincingly a merchant lord could argue his position from the council floor. Clara had been inside the Exchange Hall once before, as a girl of 14, accompanying her father to observe a tariff hearing. She remembered the enormous circular chamber, the tiered gallery seats, the raised podium at the center, where speakers presented their cases beneath the scrutiny of 200 merchant lords who controlled the flow of money across the entire kingdom. She had sat in the upper gallery with her notebook on her knees, fascinated by the theater of it, and had thought to herself that she would give anything to stand at that podium one day. She had imagined arriving in triumph. She had not imagined arriving as a woman the entire room had already decided to despise. They reached London on the evening of the 25th day. Raymond had arranged rooms at a quiet hotel near the financial district, and Clara spent the night reorganizing her presentation materials. She had distilled the 46-page ledger into a concise summary, 12 pages of key evidence, supported by original documents sealed in a leather case. The argument was built in 3 layers. First, the proof of theft from Raymond's duchy. Second, the connection to the shell companies and the Whitby solicitor. Third, and most importantly, the corrected merchant manifests showing the true commercial output of Blackstone Ridge, which was substantially higher than the fraudulent figures George had been reporting to the national trade registries. This third point was the blade. For 3 years, Raymond's duchy had been underrepresented in the national commerce tables because George's falsified reports made the region appear less productive than it actually was.
This meant that Blackstone Ridge had been paying lower national trade levies, which seemed like an advantage until you understood the consequence. Lower reported output meant less influence at the council table. Less influence meant weaker negotiating positions on tariff agreements, shipping lane access, and port priority rankings. George had not merely stolen grain and coal, he had quietly diminished the political weight of Raymond's entire province. Clara intended to reverse that in a single afternoon. The council session began at 2 o'clock. Clara and Raymond arrived at the exchange hall to find the circular chamber already filled. The tiered galleries held representatives from every major trading house in England. Clara recognized faces from the Whitmore Gala. Lord Pemberton was seated in the 3rd row, his expression sour, flanked by 2 associates who leaned in to whisper as Clara entered. Other faces she recognized from her father's social circles, men who had once shaken Edwin Ashford's hand and now would not acknowledge his daughter's existence. She felt their eyes on her as she walked down the central aisle toward the speaker's podium. Raymond walked beside her, his presence drawing its own particular attention. The Duke of Blackstone Ridge rarely appeared at council sessions. His arrival alone was enough to shift the temperature of the room. The session chairman, a portly man named Sir Harold Crane, called the chamber to order and invited Raymond to present his business. Raymond stepped to the podium, surveyed the room once, and spoke. I am here to present corrected trade manifests for the Duchy of Blackstone Ridge, covering the previous 3 fiscal years. The original figures submitted to this council were falsified by a member of my household who has since been removed from his position. The corrected figures have been prepared and verified by the Duchess of Blackstone Ridge, who will present them now. He stepped aside and gestured to Clara. The chamber rippled with murmured conversation. Clara heard fragments as she approached the podium. A woman presenting to the council. Unprecedented. The Ashford girl, the one who embarrassed Pemberton. What is Hale thinking? Clara set her leather case on the podium, opened it, and laid out her 12 pages of summary evidence. She looked up at the tiered gallery, at the 200 faces watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt, and she began. She spoke for 35 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not rush. She presented each piece of evidence in sequence, connecting the theft to the falsified reports, to the diminished trade standings, building the argument the way a bricklayer builds a wall, one solid piece at a time, each one resting firmly on the one beneath it. She cited specific figures from memory when the documents required cross-referencing, moving between numbers with the fluency of a woman who had spent her entire life thinking in arithmetic. The chamber grew quieter as she continued. The murmuring stopped. Men who had been leaning back in their seats with folded arms gradually leaned forward. Clara could feel the shift happening, the slow, reluctant recognition spreading through the room that the woman standing at the podium was not performing. She was commanding. When she reached the corrected output figures for Blackstone Ridge, she paused and let the numbers settle over the gallery like a change in weather. Raymond's duchy, properly accounted for, was the 3rd most productive merchant territory in England. Its true commercial weight entitled it to a substantially higher position in every national trade negotiation, tariff agreement, and port access ranking that the council administered. The corrected manifests are supported by original documentation which I have brought for independent verification, Clara said. I am requesting that the council update its official trade registers to reflect the accurate figures, effective immediately, and that Blackstone Ridge's standing in all ongoing negotiations be adjusted accordingly. She closed her leather case and stepped back from the podium. Silence held the chamber for several long seconds. Then Sir Harold Crane cleared his throat and asked whether any member wished to challenge the presented evidence. He looked around the gallery. Nobody spoke. The arithmetic was too clean, the documentation too thorough, the corrections too obviously legitimate. Challenging Clara's figures would require challenging the original Port Authority records, the Scarborough Counting House, and 3 independent coaching companies, institutions that had no reason to lie and every reason to protect their own credibility. The council voted to accept the corrected manifests by an overwhelming margin. Blackstone Ridge's trade standings were updated on the spot, and Clara Ashford, the woman who had been cast out of this city for the crime of being right, stood at the center of England's most powerful commercial institution and watched the same men who had destroyed her family's reputation write her conclusions into the official record. As they left the exchange hall, stepping out into the cold London afternoon, Raymond walked close beside her. The street was busy with carriages and foot traffic, the familiar rush of the capital pressing in from every direction. "Your father is in London," Raymond said. "I made inquiries this morning. He is still at the family house in Cheapside." Clara stopped walking. She had not seen her father since signing the marriage contract. Letters had been exchanged, brief, careful letters in which neither of them said what they actually meant. Edwin Ashford had thanked Raymond for settling the family debts. He had congratulated Clara on her marriage. He had said nothing about the gala, about Pemberton, about the 6 days of silence in his study while the rejection letters piled up. "We could call on him this evening," Raymond said, "if you wished." Clara looked at the man standing beside her on the crowded pavement. 3 weeks ago, he had been a stranger with a contract. Now he was remembering her father without being asked, offering something she had not requested, reading a need she had not spoken aloud. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." Raymond nodded once and raised his hand to signal their waiting carriage. As Clara climbed inside, she caught a last glimpse of the exchange hall through the window, its limestone columns bright in the winter sun. And she thought about the girl who had once sat in the upper gallery with a notebook on her knees, dreaming of standing at that podium. She had not imagined it would happen like this. She was glad it had. They returned to Blackstone Ridge on the 29th day, arriving in the late afternoon as the winter sun hung low over the harbor, painting the sea in shades of copper and iron. The estate looked different to Clara now. The same gray stone walls, the same narrow windows, the same austere lines that had struck her as cold and unwelcoming when she first arrived.
But somewhere in the past 4 weeks, the coldness had become familiar, and familiar had become something close to home. The household received them with quiet efficiency. Mrs. Hargrove met them at the door with a tray of tea and a summary of domestic matters that had accumulated during their absence. The cook had prepared a roast. The fires had been lit in every room. The archive was exactly as Clara had left it, her notebook still open on the long oak table, her pencils lined up in a neat row beside the lamp. Clara spent the evening closing the final threads of the supply crisis. George Hale had departed the estate without incident during their absence, taking his personal belongings and leaving behind a set of keys and a letter addressed to Raymond that Mrs. Hargrove had placed on the study desk unopened. Raymond read it alone and said nothing about its contents. Clara did not ask. A new quartermaster had been appointed, a woman named Margaret Poole, recommended by the harbor dockmaster, who had managed warehouse inventories for the Whitby Shipping Authority for 12 years. Clara had reviewed her credentials before leaving for London and approved the appointment. Margaret arrived on the morning of the 30th day, a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who shook Clara's hand firmly and asked for access to the vault records before she had even removed her coat. Clara liked her immediately. The corrected trade standings from the council had already begun producing results. 2 merchant houses that had previously ignored Raymond's correspondence sent letters requesting meetings. A coal supplier in Newcastle offered a long-term contract at favorable rates. The harbor's guildmasters, still nursing their wounds from the dinner, submitted their revised tribute calculations without a single inflated figure. Word had traveled through the northern trading networks that the Duchess of Blackstone Ridge read numbers the way a hound follows a scent, and nobody wanted to be the next man caught holding a fabricated ledger. By midday, the crisis that had consumed the past 3 weeks was fully resolved. The vaults were being restocked through emergency purchases arranged by Margaret. The outer towns had been notified that their winter allocations would be delivered on schedule. The shell companies in Whitby had been reported to the county magistrate, and the solicitor who had filed their registration papers was facing his own investigation. Every loose thread had been tied, every open question answered, every column balanced. Clara closed the last ledger in the archive at 1:30 and sat back in her chair. The room was quiet. Dust motes drifted through a beam of winter sunlight falling from the high window. She looked around at the shelves of records, the maps pinned to the walls, the scarred oak table where she had spent so many hours reading the hidden story of this duchy, and she felt a stillness settle inside her that she had not experienced in a very long time. She had been useful. Genuinely, thoroughly, completely useful. And for the first time in her life, that usefulness had been recognized rather than punished. A knock came at the archive door. She turned to find Raymond standing in the entrance, dressed in his usual dark coat, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked uncomfortable in a way she had not seen before, the discomfort of a man preparing to do something unfamiliar. "Walk with me," he said. They left the manor through a side door that opened onto a narrow stone path climbing the cliff face behind the house. Clara had seen the path from her bedroom window, but had never taken it. The steps were worn smooth by generations of feet, carved into the rock with the patient precision of people who understood that some things were worth building slowly. The path ended at a broad stone balcony jutting out from the highest point of the ridge, a natural overlook where the cliff dropped away to the sea 100 feet below. The view was extraordinary. The harbor spread out beneath them, its piers and warehouses miniature in the distance, the merchant vessels rocking gently at their moorings. Beyond the harbor, the open sea stretched to the horizon, gray and endless, under a sky streaked with the pale gold of a winter afternoon. The wind was steady and cold, carrying the smell of salt and the distant cry of gulls. Raymond stood at the stone railing, looking out at the water. Clara stood beside him, close enough that their sleeves nearly touched. "I owe you an apology," he said. Clara turned to look at him. "For what?" "For the manner in which I brought you here, the contract, the library, the way I spoke to you that day, as though I were purchasing equipment for the estate rather than asking a woman to share my life." He paused, choosing his words with the same deliberation he applied to everything. "I told you I needed your mind. That was true, but it was also incomplete." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small velvet box, dark blue, worn at the corners. He opened it and held it out to her. Inside was a ring, a simple gold band set with a single stone, not a diamond, but a deep blue sapphire, the color of the sea on a clear morning. The ring was old, its band slightly thinned by years of wear, and Clara understood instinctively that this was not something purchased for the occasion. This was something kept, something inherited, something that carried the weight of the family it came from. "This was my mother's," Raymond said. "She wore it for 31 years. My father gave it to her on the day he told her that their marriage, which had also begun as an arrangement, had become the single most important thing in his life." He looked at Clara directly, and his face held none of the careful blankness she had grown accustomed to. Every wall was down. Every door was open. The man standing in front of her was entirely present, stripped of the armor he wore so habitually that most people assumed it was his actual skin. "I am not skilled at this, Clara. I have spent my life managing trade routes and supply chains and difficult men who try to steal from me. I understand contracts and cargo weights and quarterly revenue projections. I do not understand how to tell a woman that she has changed the way I see my own life. But you have, and I am asking you, properly this time,
without a document or a clause or a deadline, whether you would choose to stay here with me as my wife, in truth and not merely on paper. Clara looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at the harbor below, the town she had come to know, the estate she had fought to protect. She looked at this serious, quiet, stubborn man who had chosen her mind before he understood her heart, and who was now standing on a wind-swept cliff, offering her both of his. She took the ring from the box and placed it on her own finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her hand.
"I already chose," she said. "I chose in the library. I chose on the train. I chose in the vaults and the dining hall and the archive at 2 a.m. when I was cross-referencing your cousin's bank drafts. Every day I have been here, I have chosen this. I simply did not have the proper ring to prove it." Raymond looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened that Clara had never seen before and would remember for the rest of her life. The Duke of Blackstone Ridge, the man whom every merchant in England feared and every guild master dreaded, smiled. A real smile, full and unguarded, breaking across his face like the first light of morning coming over the sea. He took her hand, and they stood together on the overlook, watching the harbor below and the wide grey ocean beyond it, the wind pulling at their coats, the winter sun low and golden on the water.
Behind them, the manor waited, solid and permanent, full of ledgers and maps and the evidence of a life built on numbers and trust. Ahead of them, the sea stretched out without limit, the same way the future does when two people finally stop calculating the cost of everything and simply decide that what they have built together is worth more than anything either of them could have measured alone.